Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. So as we gather, we are reminded that throughout Canada, we are situated on Indigenous land, both ceded treaty land and unceded land. This land is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As a country, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work. Today, I acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee and neutral people whose traditional territory I'm broadcasting live from today. So Secret Path Week is a national movement commemorating the legacies of Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack. The Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund would like to inspire all Canadian classrooms to use this week to answer Gord Downie's call to action and do something as we share knowledge and work towards meaningful reconciliation. So with this being Secret Path Week, we have events for classrooms to join all week long, connecting them with Indigenous leaders, Indigenous artists, Indigenous scientists, to learn some of their stories, learn about some of the work that they're working on, and to have a chance to ask some questions as well. So if you head to exploringbytheseat.com, under the special events, you can find Secret Path Week. You can join into the events in camera spots. You can join into the events through YouTube, watching live, sending in some questions, or joining us afterwards. All right, well, let's get to our 1 p.m. event. Absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Tasha Hubbard. She's a writer, a filmmaker, and associate professor at the University of Alberta. Also joining us today, we have Jade Tootoosis. She is the sister of the late Colten Boushie and has been one of the spokespersons for her family in their international pursuit for justice. She currently works with the Faculty of Native Studies as their Alumni Relations and Community Engagement Coordinator. So let's bring Jade and Tasha into the event with us. Hey, Jade. Hey, Tasha. How you doing today?
Good, thank you.
All right. Well, it's so great to have you joining us live today. We're really looking forward to getting to know you a little bit better and talking a little bit about the film as well as some of the social justice issues. So Tasha, I'll let you take over for a little bit and I'm queued up and ready for the clips when you would like them.
Great. So thank you so much. Yeah, I just want to say, we're going to be talking today about the film nîpawistamâsowin, We Will Stand Up, which follows the family of the late Colten Boushie. And before we get into what happened to him and the family and the story of the film, I'd like to turn it to Jade, who can introduce you to who Colten was as a person before we get into what happened to him. So I'm going to turn this to Jade.
Thank you for that, Joe, and thank you for that, Tasha. Just really feel honored to be here today and to gather with students across Canada and have this discussion. Before we get into things, I just like to reflect and bring my late brother into the space and acknowledge who he was. So my name is Jade Tootoosis. I am the sister to the late Colten Boushie. Colten was one of the younger ones amongst my siblings, amongst my generation. And I always remember him being at family gatherings as one of the escapios who helped serve the food, who helped get the firewood, who would help with various gatherings within our family. But one of the things I always like to reflect on is the kind and the generous, but most of all, the humorous personality that he had. He was a very funny individual that liked to make those around him smile and laugh and feel good. He would get up out of his seat to go over and to hug you to make sure that that he appreciated you being there. And one of the things that, in our family, we all have these interesting nicknames that we have for those around us. And it's interesting that they usually have something to do with food. So growing up, we didn't really know him as Colten. We always knew him as Coco. And this stems from the fact that, his older brothers, his two older brothers, who he was usually always with, they were usually inseparable. They couldn't pronounce his name accordingly, so they would call him Coco. And that just kind of stuck. And for myself, I always thought we called him Coco because he was one of the darker, one of the more browner amongst us in our group. But he was just this very outgoing person who enjoyed to make those around him happy, feel safe, and feel welcomed. And we just miss him every day. He's that little brother that everyone wishes that they had. And that's a little bit about my brother Colten.
Thank you for that, Jade. So on August 9th, 2016, Colten and his friends entered a farmyard nearby their reserve, which is Red Pheasant. And this happened around North Battleford's area in northwestern Saskatchewan, which is Treaty 6 territory. And on that day, they entered in. Colten and two young women were asleep in the back of the vehicle, and two young men drove into the farm. Gerald Stanley and his son Sheldon Stanley were fixing a fence in the yard, and one of the young men got out of the car and jumped onto a parked quad, at which point in time the Stanley family started yelling and swearing and started to come over, and what they said scared the young man enough that he jumped off the quad into the vehicle, and they attempted to drive away. At this point, Sheldon Stanley had caught up to the vehicle and took his hammer that he'd been using to fix the fence and smashed it into the windshield of the vehicle that the young people were in. And at that point, according to the court record, Gerald Stanley ran and grabbed a loaded handgun. And this handgun is a weapon of war that was used Tokarev is the name of the gun. Went and grabbed it, loaded. It was loaded already, and started shooting. And at this point, the young people had ran into a vehicle that as they were trying to leave the farmyard, and rendered their own vehicle undrivable. So with the events that were happening, the two young men who were awake jumped up and ran out of the yard, and two shots were fired. They testified in their fist that they felt the bullets go by. And a few seconds later, Colten was killed by Gerald Stanley to a close range shot to the back of his head. This case just stunned everybody. How quickly things escalated from these young people who were driving on the rim of their vehicle. I forgot to mention that their tire had blown out, so they were driving on the rim, which affected the maneuverability of the vehicle. How quickly it escalated to this young man losing his life. The police were called, and what happened is that the witnesses, who were the two young women and the young men, were all treated as though they were the perpetrators. And Gerald Stanley and his family had an hour to sit and drink coffee and talk about what happened, although they testified they didn't talk about it at all, that they just sat and drank coffee. And what happens is the RCMP do investigate, but they, didn't interview the witnesses until almost 18, 19 hours later. The witnesses weren't allowed to talk to people, were in their same clothing, hadn't been fed properly. One of them was taken on a high-speed chase and handcuffed in the back of a police vehicle. At the same time, the RCMP had gone in to inform Colten's mother and his siblings, and came into their house without permission. And when Debbie, the mother, fell down in grief, she was then accused of having been drunk, and the family was given no support, no victim services attention immediately. Just armed officers came up into their home. So this launches this whole situation where the rest of the world starts to find out what's happened. And, I was driving on rural roads myself with my son and my nephew, who were 9 at the time. I knew Jade from before. She's married to my cousin. And we started talking about our sympathy for Jade, and my thoughts went to the family of Colten, how horrific this was. But what the RCMP also did is they released a press release. And in that press release, they said that, 5 young people are being investigated for theft. And that as a result of this attempted theft, one of the young people died. And so what that did is it set a narrative. It told a story that blamed these young people. And in journalism, they talk about where you put your lead. And sometimes the journalists will say, they buried the lead, and that the real heart of the story comes in the second paragraph, as opposed to what is actually happening here. And in this case, a murder, a suspected murder should have been the lead, but instead the RCMP put that in the second paragraph. And what their first paragraph was all about these young Indigenous people having been accused of theft. So what that did is it allowed social media and comments on social media to explode, and all of it blaming Colten for his own death. Celebrating this farmer for having taken care of the problem, which is the Indian problem. And some people, these are not, when a lot of people told me at the time, well, these are people who are uneducated, who don't know any better. And I'm like, so I actually started investigating who these people were, and others did as well. And no, these are people with education. These are teachers. These are engineers. And in some cases, elected officials were saying things like, Gerald Stanley's a hero, and shoot, shovel, shut up, things like that. So it really sort of, people talked about like it increased racial tension, but what it actually did was it pulled back, all of the racism that has been going on since the beginning, since colonialism, since the settlement of Canada. This racism is not new. It's just became much more of a focus. So I'm watching this happen. This is my community. I'm not from Red Pheasant, but I'm from nearby. My dad's family is from nearby, and I grew up in Saskatchewan. I was adopted out as a baby through the 60s scoop and grew up on a farm, and I grew up around guns, and I was really, struck by the fact that this farm family had something like, I forget what the number was, but 20 some weapons on their property, that they had a handgun just ready and loaded. And I thought about how my grandpa and my dad taught me about gun safety, and how, I was never even allowed to point a toy gun at my brothers without getting heck, that, to respect a firearm was so entrenched as part of rural culture. I kept thinking, how did we get to this? How did we get from what I grew up with as a young person to, no questions asked, no conversation, someone runs and gets a gun and starts shooting it. So this was really something, as a filmmaker, I started to think, no, the media wasn't questioning the press release from the RCMP. And I thought, okay, what is this family of this young man going to go through as they attempt to, see how the Canadian legal system is going to treat them as victims, to treat Colten as a victim. And, I was finishing a documentary at the time and approached my same producers and said, I think we need to follow this. I think we need to see where this is going to go. And so I approached the family of Colten through my relationship with Jade, and I met Colten's mother and other family members. And I just said, I don't know what we'll be able to, because it's tough to raise the resources to make a big film. And I said, I'm not sure what this will end up as, but at the very least, we can document these early days, and how the legal system is going to treat you. And unfortunately, we did make the film, and unfortunately, I think all of our fears and concerns about how systemic racism that is in the Canadian legal system, how it was going to impact the investigation and the trial. And eventually, Gerald Stanley was acquitted of all charges in the trial. And, the investigation had a lot of flaws that happened. The family of Colten, and Jade can speak to this herself, was treated, they were left out. They were met with even hostility by the Crown, by the RCMP. The RCMP, there was a complaint in how the RCMP treated the family when they told them about what happened. And of course, the RCMP investigated themselves and cleared themselves of any wrongdoing. So these were the sorts of things that were happening as time went by, getting closer and closer to the trial. And Jade was a witness to the jury selection, in which the defense lawyer for Colten. So the way it works for juries is every province has a different way of figuring out how they're going to choose jurors. In Saskatchewan, it's through our health cards. And in Saskatchewan, anyone who is a status Indian has an R marked on their health cards. So it's visible who's Indigenous and who is not in our health cards. So that's been kind of flagged as a potential issue. So they use health card records to bring up a jury pool. And people have to show up at a certain day. They're not helped with their travel. The jurisdiction where the trial happened is highly Indigenous, but it's also very northern. And so people had to find a way to get to there. So even with all of these already barriers that Indigenous people face to be on a jury, there were still a number of Indigenous people who ended up in that room, and a number who were perfectly willing to serve on this jury. And in the initial pool of people, there were 40 people who were initially brought forward. These were people willing to serve. They'd already gone through, the process of, people were able to excuse themselves if they knew the families or things like that. So these 40, out of the 40 potential jurors, 5 were Indigenous. And, we watched as the first young man, Indigenous man was called up. And I think he was like the second or third person to go up. And he was struck down immediately by the defense lawyer by what's called a peremptory challenge. So in this, the defense and the prosecutors get to use challenges to pull people off the potential jury without giving reasons why. And so the defense lawyer, there were 5 invisible Indigenous people who were in that initial 40, and all 5 were challenged by the defense, ensuring a jury of white peers. So Gerald Stanley's peers, but not any Indigenous people. And what wasn't reported on is they also challenged any juror of color. So, there were a couple of people who were visibly Asian in background, and they were struck off the jury as well. So, the film follows this quite closely. And then what it follows is what the family does after the acquittal. And we had thought we were going to make a 50-minute film, and we ended up making a 98-minute film because of the family's continued advocacy. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. So the film has sort of 3 threads. It follows what the family goes through right from early days, that right through to about 6 months after the acquittal. It also became a bit of a personal film, and there's a personal thread in the film that is my own family's story. And I don't do that lightly. I've been asked to do that in the past, and I've never agreed to. But with this one, because I felt pretty strongly as a mother of 2, of these Indigenous boys who are in my life, who I'm here to protect and take care of, and the concerns I had for them about what's going to happen when they're adults, what's going to happen when, and already they're 13 and they're 5'8" and 5'11". So already they're being perceived as adults. What does that mean for them? What does this case mean for them? And I also wanted to bring in my own adoptive family. And as I mentioned earlier with the gun safety, I wanted to be able to talk about these things. I wanted to be able to talk to my own family about settler colonialism, about whose territory this is, and about where we're at, where, our young people are not, able to go through their own territory without, fear of violence, and really, looking at the way to see this as violence. The third strand, I was really struck, not just, of course what had happened, but I was also really thinking about, there's been a real history of colonial violence in this particular territory, and this is the case across Canada. I mean, if you can look at the own history of your region and the different incidents that have happened. But I knew a lot of people weren't aware of the colonial history of the Battlefords, and that in the Riel resistance in 1885 that came about because of starvation policies, because of these the Canadian military being called to suppress, and the intention of some of that Canadian military to actually slaughter Indigenous people. As a result of all of this, there were 8 Cree Warriors who were hung without a trial in 1885. And the local residential school children were forced to come and witness this. And, I had known that story through oral history from my own family, but I was aware that general Canadians didn't know this, that this is part of the history, that the RCMP have a history of enforcing oppressive policies across Canada, and especially, in our case, in the Prairies. So I wanted to have a historical thread. And so there's animation that runs throughout the film to try and kind of do a catch up of, like, if you didn't know this now, you need to know this. If you didn't know this already, you need to know this now, and that the things that happened in this case are not isolated, and they're not happening just in the now, that this is a continuation of things that have been happening for a very long time. So I'll ask you to play the clip, which is a character in the film who originally wasn't meant to be a character, but he kind of came forward and throughout when we started looking at the editing, and it's his response to what happened. Right, this is immediately following the verdict, when not just people in Saskatchewan, I think, but people across the country were absolutely gutted that there were no consequence in the murder of this young man. So I'll have you play the clip now.
In this area, there's been a lot of animosity, a lot of racism for many, many years, many generations. That's not strange to us. You have 8 men that were hung here in the late 1800s. Why? Because they're trying to protect and feed their families. We have one of the chiefs, filmmaker, that's being exonerated. Why? Because they understand now that they're trying to protect and feed their families, not criminals. But it's the non-First Nations narrative often that wins. And that's got to change.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So, I'm going to turn it over to Jade, because what happens the very next day after this verdict and how devastated everybody is, the very next day, the family made the decision to go to Ottawa and to attempt to meet with elected leaders there. And so the verdict happened on a Friday night. Saturday, there were rallies that went up across the country to protest the verdict. And then on Sunday, we were all on a plane to Ottawa and started having meetings Monday morning. So I'll turn this over to Jade, and you can maybe talk, whatever you want to, about the situation, and I'll just open it, whatever you want to say.
All right. Thank you for that, Tasha. I really appreciate your strength to be able to give context and the background information to those that are watching, for those who haven't seen the film yet, or those who have, just to recap what we're here to talk about today. You did mention it briefly, talking about the way that my late brother was portrayed. And that's why it's good to speak at the very beginning, to bring his spirit and bring him into the conversation, so that you know that he was actually an amazing young man who was loved and missed and cherished always. And to sit here today and to be able to talk to what we went through, as Indigenous people, as a Cree woman from Saskatchewan, from the Prairies, I've experienced racism pretty much my entire life. I've seen it upon those around me, my loved ones. I've experienced it in classrooms. I've experienced it, you know, in the grocery store, being followed around by security. I've experienced it now going through the Canadian legal system. As Sheldon said in the video, the justice system just doesn't sit right anymore, because you want to believe that if something was to happen to your loved one or to you, that there are laws in place, there are ethics and values which will see that wrongdoing was committed and that justice is deserved on your behalf. But for my family and I, and it's difficult to know that there are many other Indigenous families across Canada who are denied justice, who are treated differently by the systems, by individuals within the system, and individuals within society. The racism is apparent in all aspects, personal and systemic. And one of the things that was really difficult, and we continue to fight to this day, is the negative perception upon my brother, my late brother Colten, as well as all those individuals in the car, his 4 other friends, who are also victims in the circumstance, who were shot at as well, as you mentioned, who were also treated poorly by the RCMP and were further traumatized and treated aggressively throughout the court system. We see the stigma and these stereotypes put upon Indigenous people through the media. The RCMP first, they spoke to a theft. They immediately labeled Colten and his friends as thieves and trespassers before acknowledging that a life was taken, as bearing the lead. And that happens all too often for Indigenous peoples. It's even apparent when you look at any news article going on the social media. If you take a glimpse in the comment section, it will show just how apparent racism is and the attitudes that people have towards Indigenous people. There continues to be a misunderstanding to treaty rights, to Aboriginal rights, but also just to the humanity of acknowledging that Indigenous people are humans that are deserving of love, of respect, and should be valued. And so that's something that my family and we've continued to have to tell people and to fight for the humanity of Colten. And that should not be apparent if all things are fair and just in this world. But in this story, you will see Indigenous people are treated differently. My family and we were treated differently. And to any Indigenous students that are watching today, I want you to know not to believe the narrative that is put out there upon you. Because you are so much more. You are not a criminal. You are smart. You have the abilities and skills to go on and to change the world. You can accomplish things that you put your mind to. There will be people who will doubt you, think less of you, and will even try to stop you. And that's not the world that we want to live in. That is not what I want for my nieces, for my nephews who are in the film. And we hope that by sharing our story, that it's through education and understanding that we shed light on this issue, this ongoing issue. And that as students, you're informing yourself, you're informing your understanding of the world, and you see that something is wrong here. And we all have a responsibility to stand up and to say something. We all have a responsibility to stand up against racism. We have a responsibility to inform and educate ourselves. What are treaty rights in Canada? Whose treaty nation are you currently residing on? What are the issues ongoing around you? It shouldn't fall on Indigenous people to have to inform you, and we shouldn't lose anybody. Nobody should have to die for these issues to be addressed. My brother's life was not taken in vain, and we hope that it creates the changes that are necessary so no other family goes through what we went through. Being a spokesperson, it is a scary thing. Saying enough is enough, and to say that things are not right, it can be scary. But know that you're not alone, that there are ancestors and people before you who have stood up and said no, who have looked forward and saw the strength of our people, and know that there are many Kookums and Mushums that are standing beside you each and every day, and they guide you and they protect you. I believe that to be true. Public speaking is definitely something that doesn't come easy, I think, to anybody, even to your teachers, to stand up and present every day, But if you speak with truth and honesty, and you come from a good place, but you're also open to having dialogue and discussion, It can be done. And for myself, I never thought that I would be speaking at the United Nations, nor would I have to speak upon something so awful, because I really wish my brother was here. I wish my brother could be sitting here today with us and he could be telling you about himself and his own experience and the things that need to be changed. But because he's not here, my family and I, we just continue to push and to fight. And I appreciate Tasha for sharing our story, because it made it easier. We didn't have to explain to Tasha the issues, the complexity of everything, why this is wrong. You know, she got it as an Indigenous person, especially being able to bring voice, and we were able to trust with her. But knowing that you can stand up and you can say enough is enough, and know that there are people with you, I hope that gives courage to everyone here today. And so I just want to share a clip. My family and I, we went to the United Nations because, as Tasha mentioned, even the RCMP investigated themselves and cleared themselves of any wrongdoing. Canada has a tendency to do the same thing as well. It will look upon itself and find very few flaws when we know there are so many. So bringing in the United Nations, an outside body, to come and take a look as to what's going on and to say this is what needs to be addressed, just gives strength and amplifies the voices of the Indigenous families and nations that are doing this work, including my families. So this is, if you could show the clip, this is what we said at the United Nations just 2 years ago.
The family is unhappy. They feel the provincial and federal governments aren't responding to their push for a structural overhaul of the legal system. Because treaties are international covenants, the family decides to advocate at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. Jade is chosen as the spokesperson.
Thank you for that. That clip is unique in that at the United Nations, when you speak on the floor like that, usually it's just the speaker who is featured, and you're given 3 minutes. Mind you, you're given 3 minutes to say what you need to say. So you need to speak with conviction and with much focus and strength. But as you could see down the aisle, there were people that were coming, and these were Indigenous people from various other nations around the world that came and stood behind us, that stood all the way down the aisle and out of screen. And that to me is it's a pretty powerful moment. And as I said, sometimes it is difficult to speak out, to find the words to express what's going on, what you went through, what you're feeling even. But know that there are people out there that stand with you, that are in solidarity with the actions that you take, and believe in the changes that are necessary. So once again, to any Indigenous students out there that are watching today, know that you are valued, that you are loved, and that you have an auntie right here who stands with you in all that you do. So don't be afraid. And for our non-Indigenous students, to become an ally, inform yourself, educate on different topics, ask questions before making judgments and assumptions. And for the educators in the room, create a safe space for these discussions to take place, because we see the racism everywhere. We experience it all the time. The classroom should be a place where we can talk about these things and come up with ideas to address them together. So I really do appreciate being here today and being able to share more upon our experience and our journey. And I just want to go back to the rest of the group, to Joe and to Tasha, and see if there's anything else you'd like to add, or if there's any questions that we might have.
Absolutely. Well, Tasha and Jade, thank you so much for what you're doing and sharing with us today. Tasha, thank you so much for shedding a light on this issue and going beyond the first paragraph. I think you put it so well, that there is so much more, and oftentimes it's left out. So you've really shed a light on this entire story, which, very well, much of it could have been swept away and easily ignored. And Jade, thank you so much. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for sharing your family's story. you know, what you're doing for Colten's legacy and others who are not facing justice. So thank you for your courage in sharing this story. Well, we have some classrooms who are joining us via the live on camera with us. We have some other classrooms who are joining us live via YouTube as well. So if there is a question from our camera classrooms, feel free to put a message to me in the chat and I can bring you in for your question. But don't feel pressured either. If you just want to digest and talk with your class about what we learned about today, that's absolutely fine as well. And the same thing via YouTube. If you have a question, feel free to add one in. I do want to say hi to the classrooms who are joining us on camera today. We have Mrs. Hall's grade 12 students who are joining us. They're in a virtual class in Toronto, Ontario. We have Miss Tram Pleasure students who are joining us, grade 9s in London, Ontario. And then we have Miss Kisak's class joining us. They're in Brantford, Ontario. Okay, we do have a few things that came in, some comments from the groups. Mrs. Tram Pleasure would just like to say that that was so powerful today, and your passion and conviction was apparent and felt, Jade. So she really enjoyed, you know, they were really affected by what they heard today, and your passion shone through. As well, our group from the SNP STEAM Academy, so their grade 11 law class, who was joining us today, they also are thanking you for sharing, you know, what's probably not easy, but thank you for sharing. And Ms. Hall's class is also saying on behalf of her class, they want to thank you for your time and your stories that you did share with us today. So Jade, I have a question for you to kind of get things started a little bit. You know, speaking like you said at the beginning, you know, you never expected to be in New York speaking at the UN, especially about what you were speaking about. So, you know, I'm curious to know how you felt in that moment in front of that body, and, you know, with your 3 minutes, having so many other Indigenous people from other countries come to support as well. And then, you know, what drives you? You're obviously very strong and courageous. Where do you find that strength?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to all the classes for your very kind and supportive words. You might see throughout the film, and also behind me, I have many ribbon skirts. Ribbon skirts are a form of fashion and expression on behalf of many Indigenous women in various nations. And for myself, it instills this sort of armor and pride. It makes me feel good and connected to my people across the nations. And also at the UN, you might even notice I have a beaded cape that was made for me by a very close friend of mine from the Onion Lake Nation, Cree Nation. And when I wear these different things, from my beadwork to my ribbon skirts, it helps me feel more connected to my people. I'm not afraid to be a Cree woman. I'm very visible. It's apparent from my skin. But to be able to express myself in a way that makes me feel good, makes me feel stronger, and gives me that courage. I mean, those beads on my cape at the UN, I was nervous. My stomach was in knots. My throat was dry. Probably a good couple hundred times that day, I kept sitting up and had to focus and look at my words, because we didn't know when we were going to be called upon. They called upon people in different orders. So I had to be ready at all times. And sometimes that got to be exhausting and isolating. And it was the beads on my cape that all of a sudden I felt like I was being hugged. I felt like I was being wrapped around, not only by my good friend who made the cape for me, but by all the kukums and mushums that came before me. And that's where I get my strength. I look at Chief Big Bear, and I look at Chief Powmaker, and I look at my kukum who is a survivor of residential schools, and I see the strength in them. And I see where I'm at today. And I know that there is so much more ahead of me and so much more good things ahead for future generations. And I only hope that the things that give me strength will give strength to others.
Okay. We have a few questions that have come into the chat from some classrooms. Our grade 11 law class is wondering about the experience of coming to Ottawa and meeting with various politicians. Did you find them receptive? You know, were you surprised by some of the responses, or did you leave mostly kind of feeling disappointed? And Tasha, you can jump in, or Jade, whoever wants to talk a little bit about the experience.
Well, I would say I was surprised that when we got to Ottawa, we got to meet so many different ministers who held different portfolios. But those meetings were very, very short in time frame. As you watch the film, the issues and the complexity of everything is so much to go through. And when we met with ministers, at times it felt like we were constantly having to update them on the circumstances and everything we were going through. And as most politicians, they will say the things that they believe we want to hear. But when it comes to action, we have seen very, very little action on their part. Our understanding, as you will see in the film, we went straight to Ottawa after the verdict. Those were supposed to be the initial meetings, meaning the beginning of a conversation. And to this day, my family and I are still having to follow up with the different ministers in the different positions and ask them, what have you done? What are you going to do going forward? And they continue to put that burden upon our family to continue to do. And I'll say we will continue to push them. We will continue to advance and advocate for changes and hold them accountable to their words. But it can be very frustrating and disappointing to know that elected officials that are supposed to serve all citizens within the state continue to just show up for a meeting and then continue onwards as if we weren't there. I'm not sure if Tasha, you would like to add anything.
You know, I think sometimes, you know, what Jade is saying is so true, and that, you know, there are times when the family, you know, families of Indigenous people or, you know, advocates, whether, and this is for Indigenous injustices, and, you know, I think, you know, we've been watching, you know, the way in which the system is also stacked against Black Canadians and other, you know, others. You know, people go and take the time to, you know, share what's happened to them. And, you know, Jade and Debbie and Colten's family, unfortunately, are now experts in what it's like to be, you know, discriminated against within the legal system. And, you know, it's difficult for them to go and share that experience. And I think where the government goes wrong is not valuing that. And you know, they're not there for themselves. They're not there, you know, because, you know, but they're there because they're giving gifts in the sense of like, this is what needs to change and this is what we experienced. And, you know, unfortunately, I think, you know, we're in a time and place where social media sometimes takes the place of that real engagement. And so one of the things that, you know, we noticed the first time, you know, is everyone wanted these photo ops with the family, but it appears that things are being done, but the real work, which is what Jade and Debbie and the family are and the legal team of the family are offering, is, you know, no, we have experience on more specific things that can change, and that didn't happen. And when we went back in February with the film to screen it for Parliament, and unfortunately not many MPs showed up. But we did have other meetings, again with the Prime Minister, again with cabinet ministers, and, you know, they tried to start the meetings with a photo. And, you know, I had to stay quiet the first time, but the second time I was like, no, you know, no, this isn't about photo ops. This is about actually listening to them and taking what they're saying. And, you know, many people, you know, Indigenous people who have been advocating for these changes for decades. And it's really just now a matter of acting, you know, making that change, you know, and so the family continue to push for that.
Okay. One of our students in London with Mrs. Trempleasure would like to know how can we make our justice system more transparent and fair? So I know this is a huge question, but is there something that students can do, maybe to raise awareness, or are there a few steps that you'd like to see happen to help make our system more fair and more transparent?
Well, I'd say one of the things is knowledge, right? And so, I think that it's knowing how it's not fair is the big start, and we don't get taught that very often. So, that's a good start. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that was done in the 1990s. I mean, they had really, strategic, specific things that could help the legal system change. And it was virtually ignored. And the TRC calls to action, take that up again. So, I think for students, that's a really good start. And then, it is about awareness. It is about, and don't underestimate the power of a written letter, not an email, not a tweet, but pen to paper sent to the Justice Minister, sent to, the minister, Bill Blair, who's responsible for the RCMP, saying, we watched this film. We know that this is happening. And as young people, we want this to change, and they will listen to that. But it's got to be that pen to paper, because, it's easier to dismiss, online things. It matters when they get a letter that they know that they're being watched, and you are going to be voters soon, so they're caring about that.
Yeah, and I would also add, when it comes to knowledge, understanding, this film tells the experiences of what's going on currently today, and it makes it a very valuable resource, and that it is accessible. At this point, anyone in Canada can access the entire film by going on the NFB website, by going on, I believe, CBC GEM. There's different platforms that people can access the film. That way, more people are informed as to what happened to us, but most of all, informed upon the issues that continue to happen in Canada. So we need the help of everyone to share this film, especially with those that you think won't take the time to watch it, whether it's in the classroom, in the workspace, or even at home with your families, being able to say, hey, this is what I learned about today, this is what I watched today, and I think everyone needs to see it. So supporting us in that way and being able to inform others as to what's going on definitely makes a difference. And we all have a responsibility to stand up to racism. So this is something that each and every one of us could do.
So I have one more comment that I would like to share. This is from Mrs. Hall's class. It's a world issues class, and one of her students just wanted to say, to offer their condolences and recognize the courage of your family and yourself in fighting racist judicial system. So thank you so much for sharing your story, and they applaud you on your journey and wish you and your family justice. So, I can tell from the groups that are tuning in today and the comments that the story really did impact them. So, thank you so much for sharing a story that I know isn't easy to share, but I think one that needs to be shared if we're going to see changes in Canada and hopefully beyond. So Jade and Tasha, thank you so much for everything you do, everything from, shedding light on the story to continuing to fight afterwards and helping other families who might be going through similar situations. So thank you so much for sharing. And I'm just looking at the chat. I see Ross is sharing the educator guide for the film. So keep an eye on the chat there. And Ross is sharing that educator guide for the classrooms. And then I can share that link with the classrooms that joined in with us live on camera. So to those who are tuning in today, the students, a shout out to the legacy schools as well that tuned in. If you head to exploringbytheseat.com, you can find the Secret Path week events coming up Tuesday through Friday. You can join us in camera spots. You can join us on YouTube or catch the recordings afterwards to share with your classrooms as you learn this week with us, and hopefully do something and work towards those acts of reconciliation in your classrooms. So again, Tasha and Jade, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing not only the struggle, but the powerful story and standing up to make sure that it doesn't go unheard or swept away. So thank you so much for today.
Namaskar. Thank you.